Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Oscar's Cozy Corner. It has been quite the week since the Disney Dreamlight Valley showcase, hasn't it? Alongside all of the incredible updates coming to the base game, the one thing that everyone has been talking about is the brand new expansion pass, the Storybook Vale. Now, I already have an extensive breakdown of the new DLC and everything that we know so far on my channel. I cover the biomes, the characters, the critters, and everything else that we saw during the showcase. But today, I thought that it could be fun to do a little spot the reference game for the expansion pass and take a look at all of the classic Disney references that Gameloft have used to really build this world out and to make it feel like one of the most Disney-esque updates that we've had in a very long time. Whether you're a fan of Disney lore or you just enjoy spotting little Easter eggs in your gameplay, then stick around and I'll show you what I've noticed, as well as some really niche references spotted by the community and friends of the channel. To begin with, I just thought that I would mention the overarching IPs that I've noticed while combing through the DLC footage that we have so far. Now, Gameloft haven't thrown everything possible at this expansion. They have been quite reserved with their franchise usage, and they do seem to be aiming for a much tighter and much more cohesive experience than that of Eternity Isle. As we know, the majority of this DLC is centered around Maleficent and Hades, so there are, of course, a bunch of Hercules and Sleeping Beauty references, but other Disney classics that seem to pop up throughout Storybook Vale are Alice in Wonderland and Fantasia. These aren't the only references that we'll find, but they just happen to be some of the most used in the footage that we do have so far. I also just want to preface this with the disclaimer that these are not confirmed by any means. I mean, a lot of these are self-explanatory and some are obvious. However, some of those in there are just speculation based on my own Disney knowledge and that of the community. So feel free to correct me, feel free to add your own in the comments if there's something that I've missed. I'm always eager to learn more and I'm always eager to hear what you have to say, so don't be afraid to let me know. I'm going to go through these references in categories and I'm starting with environmental elements. So that's furniture, resources, map design, all of those sort of things. And first up, I do want to focus on the new well skin that we saw in the very first trailer for the DLC prior to the showcase. Now obviously this is an updated version of the well compared to what we have in the valley, but friend of the channel and the wonderful content creator Tani Games identified that the clock that Gameloft used on the well skin is incredibly similar to the clock found on Cinderella's castle at Walt Disney World. Now, I don't know about you, but this does feel like a spot-on identification. Both elements are very similar, and we do know that Gameloft are not afraid of taking elements from the parks to bring into the game. The Wandering Moon house skin that we got was a direct replica of the tea house in Shanghai, and we also of course, have a number of parks furniture items, such as the banners and the benches and that sort of thing. This definitely feels like a little nod to the staple of Magic Kingdom. It is the centerpiece of the parks, and it's not the first time throughout this video that we're going to see a little reference to what the Imagineers do at the parks. But regardless, it is an excellent spot from Tani, so thank you very much, Tani, and go and subscribe to her if you haven't already. Sticking with the new well, you might actually notice that these odd-looking horns are kind of coming out from the sides. Now, it's hard to tell what purpose they serve for the well itself, perhaps they're just decorative, but as soon as I saw them, I knew that they looked familiar in some way. I just couldn't put my finger on where they came from. Players over on the Dreamlight Leaks Discord felt the same. I will put the link to that server in the description. It's a wonderful community. I've spoken about it at length previously, so feel free to come on over. But eventually it was noticed that these little horns were actually part of Steamboat Willie dating all the way back to 1928. There are very, very similar horns, basically identical horns that sit atop the boat during our very first introduction to Mickey. And what I love about this is that we also had a Steamboat Willie nod during Eternity Isle. So now that we did get a Steamboat Willie dream style for Mickey, it does feel like the tiniest little through line between both DLCs. Just by taking a little piece here, a little piece there, it really adds like a sense of a larger universe to Disney Dreamlight Valley, and that each DLC might have little references that sort of like refer to each other as they go on and as more come out. This was another great spot by the community and the Dreamlight Leaks community in particular, so thank you very much for that. But moving on to the ruins that we see in Ever After during the trailer. Now, there are a number of walls and castle-like turrets throughout this biome that we see. At first, I was really unsure of what these were or what they could be referring to. I wasn't sure if maybe they were just sort of like environmental pieces brought in by Gameloft. You know, we do have a lot of original stuff in the game. But after a little bit of research and hearing Stephen say during the showcase that this biome was built with the Scottish Highlands in mind as one of their sort of inspirations, I ended up taking a look at Castle Dunbroch from Brave, and I am confident that this was actually the reference point for these structures, because the stonework looks similar, the turrets look similar. It does feel as though Castle Dunbroch was a great inspiration source for whatever storyline is going on over here, but also whatever environmental design they settled on. It does make sense for Brave to be represented in this way, given Merida's addition, but I just thought that this was a fun little spot, and I do think that it's a nice little nod to Scotland as well. Keeping with the ink that I just mentioned, which is trapping Merida, we do actually see this ink throughout the entire map. It does seem as though the ink is going to act in a similar way to either the swirling sands or the splinters of fate from Eternity Isle. I'm not 100% sure which is going to be the most likely, but we do know that it is integral to the story and the whole storybook theme that Gameloft are going for. Having said that, as soon as I spotted these ink splotches, I couldn't help but think about the previous Disney game, Epic Mickey. Interestingly, Epic Mickey actually just received a remake back in September called Epic Mickey Rebrushed, and a lot of you might have played that game in the past. But ink is a heavy feature throughout that game, and I did find it funny that there's going to be another Disney game that features ink kind of at its core. Now, I don't think that this one is a direct reference. There are some similarities between the way the ink's flowing on the Epic Mickey one versus Storybook Vale, but it is interesting to me nonetheless. I don't think it's a direct reference, as I say. I just think it's a funny coincidence, if nothing else. Moving on to the Lawkeeper. Now, the Lawkeeper is a central function of this new DLC. We didn't receive a great deal of detail about this, but we did get a few little things from the showcase, which I went into in my breakdown. However, visually, while this pedestal and book are not a direct reference to a single Disney movie, the concept of a storybook, and in particular a storybook opening, are quintessential Disney. We do see storybooks open some of our favorite classic Disney films. Those are including Snow White, Cinderella, Pinocchio, Sleeping Beauty. I mean, when I talk about classics, these are the real Disney classics. As we know, Sleeping Beauty is going to be a heavily referenced IP throughout Storybook Vale, so this totally makes sense as an integral part of the story, not only for Dreamlight Valley, but Disney itself. And the concept of a storybook as a device itself is just classic Disney. So even though this Lawkeeper might not reference anything in particular, I think it's just referencing Disney as a whole and those initial storybook openings that we see through so many different Disney classics. Finally, for this section, I just wanted to touch on some of the flora that we see in Ever After and what I think are probably technically going to be in the trees tab, but those are the giant mushrooms. I did go back and forth on this one because there are Alice in Wonderland elements that we see in terms of points of interest, but I couldn't actually spot anything massively familiar in terms of mushrooms and ferns in the animated version. However, when I took a look at the live action poster from 2010, the oversized mushrooms and twisted ferns are heavily featured here. So given that we know that there are Alice characters coming to the game and that they've used Alice-inspired environment pieces elsewhere, I do feel like this is a pretty solid guess. I know that the mushrooms are brighter in the game than this poster, and while they might not be direct references, I do feel like the oversizedness of them is something that Gameloft took inspiration from. But the ferns in particular did catch my eye, and I definitely feel like this was a reference point for the game designers this time around. So it does seem like Ever After is going to be a mix of Alice in Wonderland and Brave, and then probably some Maleficent elements thrown in as well. Okay, a new section, and we're moving on to the brand new points of interest that we're getting with Storybook Vale. Now, I did cover these in my breakdown video, but I was very happy to see these new points of interest, particularly for use as waypoints around the map and helping us understand where we are. But not only that, I just think they look incredibly cool. Now, this section does have the most obvious references of this video, mostly due to the fact that they are kind of taken from Hercules and Sleeping Beauty, and the fact that the Mad Hatter was mentioned by name during the showcase. However, I did want to touch on these just in case anyone is unfamiliar with those IPs, and the fact that as references, they do fall firmly under the concept of this video. Before I begin with these points of interest, I do just want to bring up another little bit of Disney lore, and that is something called weenies. I know that is kind of a weird name, but a friend of the channel, Ali, told me about weenies and the fact that Walt Disney used to refer to points of interest in this way and would often use what he called weenies as visual magnets and wayfinding points throughout the parks in order for guests to kind of orient themselves. Think of things like Cinderella's Castle, Space Mountain, the Tower of Terror. They move beyond attractions in Walt's mind and into visual cues for guests to kind of identify where they are. There is a whole backstory here about Walt and his dog, Lady, and how he coined the term, but that is probably another video and would be too much for this one. However, I do think it's interesting that Gameloft have leaned into using quote-unquote weenies throughout Storybook Vale and has kind of used them as wayfinding points for players on the map. Now that is something that Eternity Isle did not have, and that is why the map felt so vast, but also so confusing because we didn't really have anything to kind of guide us or let us know you're at this point, you're at this point. So they really seem to have learned from that, and they seem to be implementing these sort of towering structures to give us an idea of where we are on the map. And it might be a reference to Walt and his weenies. Or Walt and his weenie, I don't know. First up is the huge statue of Hades. Now this one is pretty self-explanatory. It is just a huge version of Hades, of course, from Hercules. The scale of this, however, is remarkable, and as I said in my breakdown, I do think that they took some pointers from the park's designers in playing with scale and perspective as sort of a environmental and world-building device. The Disney Imagineers and the park's Imagineers are incredible at coming up with things that feel much bigger than they are, and Disney is renowned for using perspective in that way. So it wouldn't surprise me if Gameloft maybe took some tips from this approach, because it just really helps bring a sense of scale to the valley and a sense of scale to the game. But I love this statue and I cannot wait to take a look at this in person. But sticking with Hercules as a reference, we do also have a version of Mount Olympus and the Golden Gates that you will find in Mythopia. Now, as home of the gods, Mount Olympus is where Hercules' story begins in the film, and the Golden Gates also act as a mechanism to separate Mount Olympus from the mortal realm. There is actually a lot of detail here that I'm eager to take a look at in the game, but at first glance, I do think it looks fantastic, and as a personal Hercules lover, I am so pleased that we're getting more inspiration from this classic IP coming to the game. The giant Pegasus statues can also be attributed to Hercules, but I also think that this could be a little nod to Mother Pegasus and the Pastoral Symphony sequence in Fantasia. This sequence is where giant, colorful Pegasus creatures soar over an idyllic Greek-inspired world. Kinda sounds like Mythopia, right? And we will also see more Pegasus creatures referenced again in my critters section. As noted in the showcase, this giant teapot water feature in Ever After is a direct reference to Alice in Wonderland and the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Now this is a quintessential part of Alice's story and the Alice in Wonderland lore, and the oversized teapot definitely captures the surreal sense of Wonderland, and I mean, I feel like it fits in really well with the giant mushrooms that we touched on earlier. So this is again something that I feel is a direct reference to the movies. Remaining in Ever After, we do see a castle up in the sky. Now, we do know that this is where we will find Maleficent, and the castle itself does look exactly like the one atop the Forbidden Mountain in Sleeping Beauty. Of course, that is where Maleficent lives. Now, for me, this is undoubtedly a direct reference to the Disney classic, as we can see the little bridge between buildings. It looks very, very similar, and it does make sense given that Mount Olympus is featured over in Mythopia, so it's no surprise to see Maleficent's castle over on this side of the map as its own point of interest. But the one thing I did want to note is that there is a beanstalk that we see reaching up to Maleficent's castle instead of being on top of a mountain. Obviously, I just referenced the Forbidden Mountain for that point of interest, but like I said, I do find it interesting that Maleficent's castle isn't sitting atop a mountain in Storybook Vale and instead appears to be accessed by this beanstalk. Now, when I was live streaming the showcase, I did comment on this and mention Jack and the Beanstalk, but I didn't actually realize that there was a Mickey version of this tale called Mickey and the Beanstalk. It has been mentioned a couple of times in the comments of those videos, so I do feel confident in saying now that Mickey and the Beanstalk is probably the reference Gameloft chose for this. Again, it's quite a niche reference given the age of it and how not unpopular, but not popular it is as a common Disney and common Mickey story. Since we don't have a reason for Maleficent's castle not being atop Forbidden Mountain, I will be really interested to see if the reason for this beanstalk showing up will be explained throughout the storyline, or whether we might even get a dream style for Mickey based on this movie. Moving on, and just quickly, I do want to touch on the new tapestries. Now, these new tapestries in the game are beautiful looking artworks that we are going to be able to collect and display. And it does seem as though we'll have a number of tapestries to build based on the IPs that we're going to be seeing most. Now, those are Hercules, Sleeping Beauty, Brave, etc. However, there is a little Sorcerer Mickey one just snuck in there. And I've already touched on Fantasia, but Sorcerer Mickey is also part of that 1940 movie and the Fantasmic show at Walt Disney World. Now, I did bring this up before when the Loungefly bags were released, and I made a whole video on whether Fantasmic could be inspirational to the DLC. I still think that that's the case. I don't think Fantasmic has been completely shut out. We know that Fantasia is now woven into this story, or at least woven into the environment of this story. But Fantasmic did appear on one of the Gameloft surveys at some point, so it's definitely on their radar at the very least. Because of this, I do think that we'll probably be seeing Sorcerer Mickey make an appearance at some point, whether that is in a dream-style form or whether that is during a storyline of Storybook Vale. Whatever it is an iconic look for Mickey, and his Sorcerer hat was, of course, a feature of Hollywood Studios back when it was MGM. Now, Sorcerer Mickey is my absolute favorite Mickey Mouse outfit of all time, and I really do hope that we see it, and hopefully some more nods to Fantasia and Fantasmic come to the game. Moving on to something called the Trials. Now, the Trials are a really interesting part of this DLC that we actually don't know that much about. This was all left very vague during the showcase. However, we did get a glimpse at some of the corridors and then some suits of armor that I think we may unlock towards the end of these trials. It took me a while to identify this environment because I was going back and forth and I was going through a couple of different dungeon options and sort of like looking what dungeons appeared in Disney. But I finally remembered a scene from Sleeping Beauty where Prince Philip and Maleficent talk while he's in the depths of Maleficent's castle. And I will say that the stonework looks very similar, and so does just the general vibe. So because of that and what we've seen, I do feel confident that the trials are now going to take place within the castle at the top of the beanstalk. Of course, otherwise known as where Maleficent lives. But it does seem a little nod to Sleeping Beauty, and I think we're probably going to find Aurora in here, so it makes sense that those are all tied in together, and I like that little reference. I like the little design and the environmental design coming from Sleeping Beauty into the game. I also pondered over the suits of armor for a while, and while nothing in particular jumped out at me at first, we do see some knights here and there over various Disney films, but I personally couldn't identify these as a specific reference item. The closest thing that I found was this jousting scene in the Sword in the Stone. The design of the armor does look kind of similar, and it does sort of have a couple of the same little embellishments, especially on the top of the helmet. But as I've said, we do have a lot of Sword in the Stone references throughout Disney Dreamlight Valley, especially with Merlin being kind of our like overarching guide throughout the story. So I don't think it's too much of a reach to suggest that they may have loosely based these knight outfits on what we see in that IP, or perhaps these are just totally new and totally original to Dreamlight Valley. We'll have to wait and see, and we'll have to find out how the trials transpire, because they seem very ominous right now. Finally, I just want to take a look at our brand new critters. Now, these were discussed in the showcase stream and their origins were hinted at, but just to serve as a reminder, let's take a look at each one and the inspirations that were drawn for them. First up is the owl. Now, this owl is adorable, as are all of the new critters featured in the expansion pass, and it does feel like Gameloft really took a cutesy / baby animal approach to these critters. And I mean, it pays off. At least for me, I think they look great. While all of the critters aren't direct replicas, perhaps with the exception of the winged horse, I would say that this owl is probably lifted from Archimedes, another Sword in the Stone reference. Disney does use owls across many of its IPs, and we do see them appearing Sleeping Beauty as well. They also appear in Bambi and many of the Disney classic movies. So while the owl critters for Storybook Vale don't look identical to any of these, I do feel confident in saying that Gameloft have probably looked at both Archimedes and the owl that dances with Aurora in Sleeping Beauty, especially since those IPs are heavily featured in this DLC and Dreamlight Valley itself, as we've discussed at length. Moving over to Ever After and the baby dragons that we're seeing here. Now, this one is pretty self-explanatory, and it was identified as a reference to Maleficent's dragon form in the showcase. So with that being said, there's not too much more for me to go over here. I am extremely excited for these critters. They are quite possibly the cutest designs in the game, and I cannot wait to see the other colorways. I'm personally hoping for black or maybe a dark purple to really lean into that Maleficent aesthetic, but whatever we end up with, these little dragon companions have just stolen my heart, I can't lie. Finally, we do have the little winged horses that we'll also be finding in Mythopia. Now these are in fact baby Pegasus from Fantasia, right down to the baby blue color that we see with this one. I believe that there are 5 altogether. They are blue, pink, yellow, orange, and black. Now, as you can see, this does seem to be a pretty direct reference to Fantasia, and I do suspect that we will see these other colorways come to Storybook Vale, and I am confident in saying that. I know that these are already a fan favorite, and I am beyond excited to finally see these new critters, but not only them, the poses that they're going to bring to camera mode as our companions as well. Sticking with the winged horses just before I round this critters section off, we do actually have another direct reference of Pegasus. This time it is the special edition companion, and this one is actually a baby Pegasus from Hercules, complete with their own temple as a companion house. As I said, this is another direct reference from Gameloft, as Pegasus is Hercules' loyal winged horse created from clouds by Zeus himself. This version of Pegasus is actually unique in being entirely white, and he does have more of a playful and loyal personality, which actually contrasts with Fantasia's more mythical interpretation. That does kind of go back to what I said earlier on in the points of interest section about those huge Pegasus statues, again, whether they were referencing Hercules or whether they were referencing Fantasia. But regardless, I have seen a lot of love for this companion already, and it does seem as though this companion is something that's tipping a lot of players over from the regular edition of the DLC to the more expensive magical edition. So well played, Gameloft, I suppose. Finally, to round off this video, I do just want to show off this key art to you once more. Pretty much everything that we've discussed in this video is here in this artwork. Everything from the mushrooms, the new weenies, otherwise known as points of interest, and some of the environmental design that we've touched on. The only thing that I couldn't identify, and I would really love your help with, is what this tree here might be referencing. Now, this tree was not discussed during the showcase, and I don't even think it was featured in the trailer, so honestly, I'm not sure what it could mean. Don't get me wrong, it could be nothing at all, and it might just be decorative for the artwork. Everything else featured here does seem to have some significance or some importance in the game, and this tree does take up a decent amount of space on Ever After's side. The closest thing that I got was the Tree of Life from Animal Kingdom, just minus all of its leaves. That is the first thing I thought, but I don't think that's what this is going for. I don't know. Maybe it's just a tree that they tried to fill space with. But I did spend a long time looking for something like this, and I just could not identify any sort of reference for this one. So if you do know what this could be or what IP it may be referring to or come from, then please do let me know in the comments below. You can also let me know that I am losing my mind and this is not a reference to anything at all and to get over myself. All right, my friends, that wraps up our deep dive into the classic Disney references that I think are hiding, some in plain sight, throughout Storybook Vale. I do hope that you've enjoyed a look at all of the nods and winks that Gameloft have woven into the new DLC. It does feel like details like these really make Dreamlight Valley such a rich Disney experience, and as I've said a number of times now, it does feel like Storybook Vale feels more Disney than anything that we've had before, apart from the valley itself. But let me know in the comments if I missed any of your favorite Easter eggs, or if there's a reference that you are particularly excited about. And if you're new here, then don't forget to subscribe for more Disney Dreamlight Valley news, guides, and fun videos just like this one. Thank you for hanging out with me today, friends, and until next time, I will catch you in the next one, and I will, of course, see you in the valley.